to speak about climate change's connection to migration and conflict. And you've probably seen the headlines. Climate change is anticipated to drive mass migration and spark new conflicts. But the story is actually much more complicated than the headlines would have you believe. There is clear evidence that climate change is increasingly driving people to move. This increase in mobility takes many different shapes: internal or across borders, short term or long term, planned or forced. Since 2010, the number of displaced people around the world has doubled. We see this playing out, for example, in Central America, where we're seeing the sharp increase in the number of migrants coming to the US from Central America, where the number of people facing hunger increased fourfold between 2018 and 2021, not to mention the devastation of back-to-back record-breaking hurricanes in the region. At the same time, the evidence is also mounting that climate change acts as a risk multiplier, not just for migration, but for conflict and human insecurity as well. That is to say, climate change doesn't just add to insecurity, it compounds it. The risks that people are already facing in their day-to-day lives, including threats of instability, food insecurity, access to safe and clean water, are magnified in ways that create new threats, undermine governments' ability to respond, and worsen existing conflicts and have cascading impacts across societies. Take the Sahel, for example. In the last 2 years alone, the number of internally displaced people quadrupled. According to UNHCR, there are over 3.7 million people displaced in the region. 2 million of those are displaced within their home country. These internally displaced people often end up in situations that aren't much better than the ones they left. And there are about 870,000 refugees and asylum seekers in that region. The crisis of forced displacement in the Sahel is driven by violent conflict and instability, but the root causes go much deeper to issues of extreme poverty, corruption, weak governance, and growing inequality. All of these factors are further compounded by climate impacts. But how these connections play out is complex and difficult to disaggregate. One of the challenges of climate change is the unpredictability of its specific impacts. We know that the frequency and severity of storms and droughts are increasing, but what that means for specific locations and communities on the ground is harder to know. And what the knock-on effects of its impacts, how those impacts interact with existing vulnerabilities like social unrest, poverty, a pandemic, an economic crisis, is much harder to know. So working out how, where, and to what degree climate change influences migration conflict dynamics is complicated. So let's take a step back for a minute. Why is looking at these connections even important? Well, you don't need to look further than those aforementioned headlines to understand that the need to address this intersection of issues is only growing. Just last week, the World Bank launched a follow-on to the Groundswell Report, a really significant body of research in which they model the impacts of climate change on specific regions of the world. In their new report, they warn that without immediate action on climate, rising sea levels, extreme heat, water scarcity, agricultural declines, climate could force 216 million people to migrate within their own countries by 2050. And these impacts will be felt most acutely in the regions of the world least equipped to handle them. This is not something that can be ignored. As we've seen over the last 18 months, our individual well-being is intimately and inextricably connected to our collective well-being and to the health of our planet. And to be effective in our responses, we need to really understand the causal chains, why people move, how climate influences conflict, how conflict drives migration. But once you start pulling on the threads of people's decision to move, you find out there is very rarely one factor at play. Most likely, it's a combination of social, political, economic, and demographic factors. And yes, environmental factors, with climate playing an increasingly influential role in ways that make the future less predictable. Today, climate's most immediate impacts are being felt in parts of the world least ready to respond. We've seen this playing out in headlines over the last decade. Take the crisis in Syria, for example. As many of you likely saw, this was one case where climate's connection to the conflict was boldly proclaimed in headlines. Those headlines caught a lot of people's attention, which was great for raising awareness. But while headlines are great for getting attention, they're less great at helping us understand what is really going on, how climate change is actually driving risk. But a closer look at the sequence of events leading up to the uprising illustrates one way climate change can interact with existing vulnerabilities and bad policy to the point of contributing to a major humanitarian crisis and violent conflict. In 2007, a 3-year climate-induced drought in Syria led to the collapse of crops and livestock in the northeastern breadbasket of the country. Coupled with the regime's poor governance of water access, the drought drove migration to cities that were already burdened by Iraqi refugees. In 2010, internally displaced persons and Iraqi refugees made up roughly 20% of Syria's urban population. That's a 50% increase in just 8 years, straining the city's limited resources and infrastructure. Against this backdrop of hardship and rural and urban discontent, the Arab Spring, which itself was sparked in part by a drought in Russia that led to sharp increases in global food prices, was beginning to sweep across the region. In March 2011, peaceful protests broke out. Assad's regime responded by torturing youthful protesters, and anger spread. And what had previously been considered an unlikely uprising began to take shape. So, recognizing there is a connection between climate, migration, and conflict, what do? Well, we start with what we do know. First off, migration is not bad. Long before climate change, migration was a proven strategy for resilience, for adaptation, and this hasn't changed. Migration can be an important, peaceful way to adapt to climate change if enabled by smart policy. It can act as a kind of pressure relief valve that eases pressures on communities and provides remittances to people back home. We want to avoid forced displacement and enable safe, well-managed migration for those who choose to move. Second, despite what many headlines would have you believe, most migration is internal, and those who move across borders are more often moving from one developing country to another. Moving can be expensive, so it is often those who have relatively greater financial resources, skills, or social networks who are most likely to move. You'll have to excuse my dog in the background. He's used to lunchtime right now and going outside, and so he's moving around and making noise. Hopefully you can't hear him. So the people who are able to move have the resources to move. Those left behind are sometimes referred to as trapped populations, and they're often overlooked. Third, migration is more often a result of conflict rather than a contributor to it. In fact, most migration is free of conflict. When people are displaced by natural disasters, they're even less likely to provoke tensions, given their relative vulnerability compared to host communities. Climate responses need to be conflict-proof, and conflict responses need to be climate-proof. In and of itself, this is a no-brainer. Doing it, however, requires a fairly significant rethink of how we organize institutions, government agencies, and decision-making, and the kinds of funding streams used to support interventions. Climate change will present major challenges to governments and governance. We've already seen this playing out at different scales in every region of the world, including in the countries best equipped with functioning democracies, strong institutions, and financial resources. But climate change's impacts should not absolve leaders of responsibility for how they manage their natural resources and do or don't respond to climate change. In fact, the decisions political leaders make regarding water resource management, agriculture, critical minerals, climate adaptation and mitigation strategies, etc., can be just as damaging as climate change itself. Climate change is a challenge that requires working across the scales of decision making, from the local right on up to the international and multilateral. In our research, we found that because the vast majority of migration occurs within national borders, strengthening inclusive local institutions and forms of resource management can help ease the transition for both migrants and receiving communities. This requires engaging with local communities from the outset of planning for climate responses, but also for understanding the community's perception of the risks they face. You don't want to provide a solution that at a minimum doesn't fix the problem and could even potentially create new problems. And finally, the future will probably not look like the past. Much of what we know about the relationship between the environment and migration or conflict is based on recent history, and clearly the trends are shifting. To be prepared for an uncertain future, we need to encourage better interdisciplinary thinking. We need to intentionally and meaningfully integrate climate change into decision making. And we need to respond to climate with our eyes wide open, recognizing that its impacts are interacting with systems in complicated ways that require better integration and coordination across traditionally siloed sectors. Thank you so much.